Good morning, Deepa. It's a delight to see you. Well, it's not morning where you are. Would you like to say where you are?
So I am speaking to you from a small village called Killaloe in County Down in Northern Ireland, and it's about 2 p.m.
Wonderful. It's snowing here in Hoboken,
Oh,
New Jersey. I wish I was there with you. It looks beautiful and sunny. Um, I had first heard you speak last year at Inspire Fest in Dublin, and I was incredibly intrigued by your work at the intersection of art and technology and healthcare. And the kinds of people with whom you speak and the kinds of listening you have to do to be successful in your work was intriguing to me. And I immediately thought of inviting you in for this chat. And so I let me ask you, when I first came to you and said, would you like to talk about talking and listening, speak about speaking and listening, what crossed your mind?
um, First reaction was interesting, but what does that mean? Because it's one of those things that we do every day without thinking really about it. So you piqued my interest, and that was enough at this stage. And for that, the email stood out.
Um, we talk a lot about invitational communication and extending an invitation and the transformation that can occur. And I was delighted. I wrote you and said, you're invited to speak, and you wrote back, invitation accepted. And I got this thrill, and I thought, wow, this is really the power of an invitation accepted being transformational. Um, so can you tell me a little bit about listening and in what ways you think about listening and make a conscious effort to listen better in your work?
I think it's something I've reflected on in working life, but also on a personal level in terms of home life. So whatever interaction I'm having with another human being, you are actively listening to what's being said, but you're, say, in a group meeting in a professional context, you're also listening to what's not being said, because that can be more powerful sometimes. And particularly if you're discussing something sensitive. So looking at people's body language, what they're saying or what they're not saying, and trying to really fill the gaps there and get a whole picture, and to also at the same time think about the context around what's being discussed. So you're processing quite a lot without realizing that that's what you're doing. And that's a lifelong objective in terms of learning to do that better and better. And not, I suppose, sitting there being prepared with a response that you have to get in, regardless of what's being said, so that you're to be truly active, to be truly listening. You don't have that response that's completely prepared in your head, because that means you've taken no cognizance of what somebody's taken the effort to share with you. And one of the most, I suppose, important things that I've learned is if I haven't understood something, to ask for clarification. Because I think when we're young, perhaps that's something we're a bit insecure about, not wanting to appear stupid. But I've learned, to be honest, if there's something I haven't understood, generally there are other people in the room that are in the same position, but they have just not wanted to say anything. And to be honest, I'm at a stage of life now where you care less about how people perceive that aspect of you. To me, it's more important to truly understand what's being communicated. So that was what I thought when you asked.
I appreciate your comment about thinking about what wasn't being said, but you have to give yourself time for that. You have to walk away and almost have a conversation with yourself afterwards to think about what didn't I hear, and to think about the richness of the tapestry of what was said verbally and non-verbally. Do you have a conscious process for that sort of listening after the people have spoken, or listening to oneself?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are almost phases, aren't there, in terms of conversations or communications or interactions with other human beings. There's what's happening directly at that moment, and there is that processing to some extent afterwards as well. And I would say that I tend to do that on an intuitive level, that if I'm in the car driving home, even if I have the radio on, I know that there's that sort of churn going on in my head, that's reflecting over what has just happened, and was I the best that I could have been in that situation? And also things like, for example, I was riding my bicycle this morning. That to me is probably one of the most powerful ways that I process a lot that goes on, and it's often where I get a lot of creative ideas from as well. Do you know, when you're not actively engaged in, but you're aware. So that's and that sort of experience happens when I paint as well. When you're truly in the flow, it will be almost as if you've come out of a trance and you look at the painting and you think, did I just do that? You know, where was I? And that's such an amazing feeling. So it's that different layers of that sort of feeling.
In addition to your international renown for your artwork and for the incredible technological projects that you have launched and are currently working on, you have an esteemed history doing work in the diversity and inclusion space. How do you invite people in who aren't being heard? How do you recognize them and then invite them in, or advise others to do that?
In some ways that's really easy, because I feel as if I've spent my life being the person that hasn't been heard. And I know what that feeling is like, and how devastating that impact can be. So I'm second generation Indian, born in England. I would consider myself European, British, Indian, but I've been in Northern Ireland 23 years. So my childhood farm, by and large, was in England, and I grew up with all the expectations of a second generation citizen. But I came here to Northern Ireland 23 years ago, so that was 1996, just after the ceasefires had been announced, and there was a strongly established Indian, Chinese, Vietnamese, and other small Filipino pockets of communities, but race diversity wasn't as mainstream as it is perhaps now. So it was just really interesting. We live in the countryside, and when people asked how long I'd been in Northern Ireland, whether it was a year, being complimented on my English, and I just falling about in hysterics, because it was just laughable that that's what their understanding had been. But there was no malice in it, so it was fine. But then there would have been other incidents that were more malicious in terms of being racially motivated. And then sitting in meetings, and saying things as we aren't any one single thing. I am a woman. I am Indian. I had a father that told me I had to be 3 times as good as everybody else because we weren't rich. I wasn't a man. And I was Indian. So he made that really clear because of his own experiences and the racism that he had faced. So when you have experienced something like that, you either react, I think, generally one of 2 ways. It either makes you more empathetic to people who may be in that similar situation, and more understanding of all other human beings, or you reject that learning completely and you become, I think, a major asshole is the way. So life provides you with countless opportunities for learning, and as an individual, it's up to you whether you want to take that on board. So I have chaired meetings. I have been the chair of big arts organizations, community groups. You give everybody the opportunity to speak. You are emotionally sensitive enough to know if somebody hasn't spoken for a while. And you, it's interesting, isn't it, in terms of technology at the minute that has such a horrific stereotype, or not stereotype, the reality is that there's a huge gender imbalance in terms of what is all the innovation that is not happening at the moment, because there's such a 50% of the population's voice is not being heard. That to me is madness, so I'm not sure if I've answered your question directly, but that's so I think I remember how it feels to not be heard, and that's a feeling that you never really lose. And it's like people who you hear being interviewed who go on to become perhaps fabulously wealthy, but if they have come from poor background, they will never ever shake that feeling of poverty. It stays in you and inherent. And I saw how hard my parents had to work when they first came to England, and the racism that my mother went through in terms of standing as a trade union representative, and racism from the union that she had to stand 3 times, the jobs my father didn't get, and then all the daily effects of racism. So it's, I think, and since Brexit, interestingly, it's funny, I felt the day after the referendum that I was back in the 80s, that I was back in my teenage years, that poisonous atmosphere was somehow back. The last 30 years had suddenly just been wiped. So I think it's about how you create an environment for people to feel comfortable, to voice their opinion, and to be themselves ultimately, regardless of their experiences.
Thank you. Can you remember a time when you felt particularly heard or unheard, or a time that you saw the power of somebody speaking up and making a change?
It's a really interesting question. I've got countless kind of memories in the memory bank in terms of being at meetings and not being heard. But I think for me, a turning point was when I served as a non-executive director on some organizations, but an old organization, the chair changed and a new chair came in, and he mentored me without me even realizing I was being mentored. And suddenly the whole dynamic of the board meetings changed, the attitude of the executive directors. I was allowed to make mistakes. I was allowed to speak. I was allowed to voice my opinion. And it wasn't always wrong. I came up with some perspectives and information and ways of looking at things that nobody else around that table would have, because by and large they were generally white, by and large they were generally older. So I think, it's turning that negative into a positive, rather than seeing, the things that you don't have as being a negative. You actually cherish the things that you do have, and you value what it is that you're bringing to the table, and having a certain confidence in that, and also having confidence in the fact that we all make mistakes, but for those of us that perhaps are in the minority, sometimes that mistake is magnified and spotlighted if you're the only, Indian or female in the room, and not wearing that sort of like a cross that it's okay for you to still make mistakes. You know, I'm not in that room represented every single Indian person on this planet, or every single, you know, woman on this planet as well. I'm there, absolutely. I've brought into sisterhood and bringing along other women, and I'm very proud of the fact that where I've had the opportunity to do that, I have actively done that. In terms of succession planning for different posts, that's been really, really important to me. And I suppose one of the most powerful examples of being heard is, although this is sort of as a captive audience, but speaking at conferences, perhaps last year was when I really pushed myself to become better at communicating in that forum. And I remember the first couple of conferences I did, I just read straight from the paper. I just lacked any kind of confidence, but by the end of it, you know, I'm speaking direct to an auditorium and speaking out to the audience, and I had enough knowledge in terms of what I was saying to be able to do that without notes or prompts. And that was really, really powerful. And I think the value of what you're saying comes from the learning that you've acquired, but from the experiences that other people have shared with you. And I think that's where Inspire Fest was so powerful, because I'm working in that space where people are in physical pain and people are sharing their stories, but they're also giving up their time to try, you know, the new, say, software apps that you're developing, and to give you feedback. And that you can then pass on that sharing and learning with other people, perhaps who are in need. So that's, I think, where the power, where you connect emotionally with other people. There's nothing greater than that, really, is there?
You are an absolute inspiration. Your work is inspiring, and having this opportunity to speak with you is very dear to me. Thank you very much. Anything else you would like to add?
No, I think I just one example recently. I think your email came actually a few days after this. I sit on a professional body. It's a services standard. So it's if a staff member has been accused of misconduct. And it was interesting at this hearing, we heard from all the legal people, you know, everybody in the room spoke. The one person that hadn't was the person who was accused of misconduct. And I suppose I'm proud of the fact that I asked a question of that person. And I actually sort of hate to think if I hadn't been there, if somebody else had been there. But because of the question that I asked, they were able to speak. And from the answers that that person gave, it was really clear the impact of that misconduct, because this had happened a year or two previously, just the journey that that person had been on. And it was so important in terms of the panel then discussing what the disciplinary course of action should have been. And afterwards I thought, you know, I'm just, because I was a bit nervous about, because it was the first sort of misconduct hearing that I had been on. But I'm so glad that I spoke up, not for my benefit, but because for this person's, because it was so important to hear their voice. And I don't ever want to forget that, you know, that it's so important to speak up for other people, perhaps who don't have that privilege at that particular time. So I just thought the timing of your email was really interesting. It really made me reflect on that instance.
Thank you. I'm delighted. If we can be more conscious of what we're doing all of the time in speaking and listening, that's part of what we're trying to do here. That's part of what we're trying to do, is just drop a little lens and be a little bit more thoughtful. Again, I thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to see you and such a pleasure to speak with you. And to hear your voice in addition to seeing all of your artwork and your painting is a treat. Thank you.
Thank you, Thaler. Thank you.